Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today, I want to address one of the most common misconceptions that often comes up in discussions around what we believe, namely, what it means to be an atheist. Different people use the word different ways, and it inevitably confuses people when I tell them I'm an atheist, so I want to have a video I can point to that definitively clarifies my position. Much of the confusion around the discussion is because when people decide on definitions, those who believe in God tend to set up a trichotomy, while non-believers tend to set up two dichotomies. It isn't that either is wrong, they're just different. And when people are used to using one, it can be hard to speak to someone using the other. Under the trichotomy scheme, being theist means holding a belief in a God worthy of worship, while atheism is holding the opposite belief that a God doesn't exist or is evil. The undecided middle then belongs to a class of their own, the agnostic. Under these definitions, there isn't much distinction between believers and non-believers if they don't claim to actually know their beliefs to be true, while the Gnostic claim to knowledge is implied for both theists and atheists. But in the dual dichotomy scheme, first you are either theist or atheist. You either believe in God or you do not. Then you are either Gnostic or agnostic. You either claim to know your belief is true or you don't. It gives you a little 2x2 grid. Gnostic theists say that they know God to exist. If you claim to be a prophet or a witness to a miracle, or you think you have a strong philosophical reason to believe, this is probably you. If you claim to know that God doesn't exist, as I do, then you're a Gnostic atheist. I don't see how someone like me could use revelation to back up their claim, but the option to be convinced by a philosophical argument still holds. These two groups would correspond with the theists and the atheists, respectively, in the trichotomy. The agnostic theists are then those who hold a belief in God, but not because they are convinced. Perhaps they simply intuit that reality must have a creator, or they believe out of solidarity with their community. And finally, agnostic atheists are those who lack a belief in God, but don't claim to know that God is non-existent. Generally, if you are dissatisfied by the arguments you've heard in favor of God, and you don't see any intuitive reason to think nature requires one, then you're in this category. Together, the agnostic atheist and the agnostic theist make up the agnostic category of the trichotomy. In my experience, of those who call themselves theists, most are Gnostic. While there are certainly some who hold to their faith without much thought, most theists have either had a convincing personal experience or find some philosophical reason compelling. To them, the dual dichotomy is laborious, taking an extra word to specify their certainty. The trichotomy is easier to use because that certainty is built into the definition. And on the other hand, those who call themselves atheists are overwhelmingly agnostic. To them, going by the trichotomy makes them merely agnostics. It can feel like sitting on the fence, and in conversations with theists, their opponents can dismiss them on the basis of simply being denialist. Using the dual dichotomy lets them take the more noticeable position of calling themselves atheists, only adding in the agnosticism when pressed. And while I know many theists find this frustrating, I think that this position is an important source of criticism that needs to be taken seriously. To both myself and the theists, agnostic atheists are the most neutral third party we'll find who will hold our feet to the fire and force us to demonstrate the validity of our positions. Of course, as one of the few atheists who does claim Gnosticism, I'm fine with using either scheme. In both cases, I'm simply an atheist. To me, the more important thing is to clarify. When you're having a conversation with someone who doesn't believe what you believe, try to recognize which intention they have, and if you aren't sure, ask. If the nuance is warranted, you can talk through what each other's position is, rather than trying to boil it down to a single word whose definition you don't even agree on. So in that vein, I have a figure that I find quite interesting. It starts with considering the 2x2 grid of the dual dichotomy, and the more linear layout of the trichotomy. One can almost imagine an intermediate U-shape, wherein one side represents atheism, theism on the other, and agnosticism in the middle. You can move left to right as you change your belief, and the height can in some way express the certainty of that belief. At the top of the U, you are so certain of your belief as to say that you know it to be true. If we make axes out of those ideas with what you believe to be the likelihood of God's existence on the x-axis and your confidence in that belief on the y-axis, we can create a new table that I think can shed some light on where individuals stand. I will note that on this diagram I've come up with, the vertical scale is imprecise. I've labeled some rough guides, from having no knowledge at all to the very limits of human knowledge. Basically, if you've never thought about God, you put yourself at the bottom. And if you spent your whole life on the question, you can go at the top. Any person can imagine a dot that represents them somewhere on this chart. If you've thought about God a lot and think it's an unknowable question, you go about here. If you're a 12-year-old who's been raised to believe in a God, you go here. If you're an inanimate object and nobody cares about your opinion, about here. And one of the reasons I think this is interesting is that you can see people's life journeys on this chart. For example, when I was a child, I found God's existence unintuitive. I was being raised on the Bible, but I never quite saw what made it different than any of the other fiction books I read. But as I got older, I began to understand some of the philosophical arguments for God, and in particular I found the teleological argument convincing. I remember the mousetrap example, where if you take away any part of the mousetrap, it stops working. Likewise, if you take any part of a living organism away, it dies. How could evolution occur in the face of such a challenge? So I would have put myself about here. But as I went through high school, I started learning more about biology and statistics and physics, and I realized that nature was perfectly capable of accounting for the complexity of life. Without that argument, and with the lack of evidence I otherwise had, I fell back on my earlier intuitions and became an agnostic atheist. I spent nearly a decade not really pondering my beliefs, instead focusing on getting my social life together since I had just given up the community I grew up in. But I'd still have the odd conversation on the topic with my family, and eventually I got back around to thinking about it. And after putting a name to some of the ideas that made me find God's existence unlikely, I realized that the argument of ice I had created allowed me to reject any uncaused intelligence, including God. I realized then that I was Gnostic, putting me about here, where I'd placed myself today. Another way I can imagine this being useful is a sort of before and after survey for live audiences of debates. I think it'd be cool to see the blob of dots shift one way or the other depending on whether one side made any good points. Or if the debate just reinforces everybody's biases, then the blob may split down the middle and move towards both sides. So if anyone wants to take a screenshot of this and use it to explain their own story, or take a survey of an audience, or whatever else you come up with, feel free. I know it doesn't solve any of the problems with the definitions, but it does help provide a more fluid and precise way to express your beliefs. So if you find it helpful, great. And if you think it's unnecessarily complicated and find yourself needing to calm down, maybe go read a fucking book.